Welcome to the Evening Review. Let's have a look at today's headlines. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jemima Beekers. I'm your host this evening. Now, the world will be joining Namibia this year in celebrating the homecoming of the Windhoek Declaration, which is essentially the Bible of media freedom. We have in studio this morning Gwen Lister, a veteran journalist who played a very crucial role in the crafting of this very important document. Thank you for joining us, Gwen.
Thank you, Jemima. Thanks for having me.
Now, Gwen, do you think the Windhoek Declaration has anything to do with Namibia being ranked the freest press on the continent, or is it a mere coincidence?
Well, yeah, I think the latter. I think it's a coincidence, but it's a happy coincidence. The Windhoek Declaration definitely paved the way for free, independent press on the continent, but I think in Namibia the seeds had already been sown. So I think, yes, it didn't directly impact, but of course there are ways in which it made the atmosphere a lot more free and open for journalists to operate.
Now, how do you think has the declaration put Namibia on the world map?
Well, that it definitely did. I mean, I think the hosting of this seminar in 1990 was absolutely amazing in the sense that the adoption of the Windhoek Declaration, which, as you said, is a very historic document, especially for African journalists, paving the way as it did for a free, independent and pluralistic press. The important thing to remember is the time this happened. Namibia had become independent and we had a very good constitution which entrenched press freedom. So I think this was one of the reasons that the actual seminar was held here. South Africa was still in the process of change. The apartheid wasn't gone yet. And as for the rest of the continent, there was still a lot of one-party states which controlled most of the media. And independent media was very few and far between on the continent. And of course, at the time, we must remember the environment was mainly print and radio. There wasn't television and there certainly wasn't social media. So what actually happened after the Windhoek Declaration is it got finally ratified by both the Southern Africa Development Community as well as the African Union, and more so further afield, obviously the United Nations General Assembly then pronounced the day of the adoption, May 3, as International World Press Freedom Day, which I think a lot of African journalists don't realize the commemoration of that day comes from that Windhoek seminar. And added to that is the Windhoek Declaration spurred similar declarations in other parts of the world. There was the Sana Declaration in Yemen. There was the Declaration of Santiago in Chile. There was the Alma Ata Declaration in Kazakhstan. So the rest of the world followed suit, pressing for independent, free, and pluralistic press. And I think that is probably one of the greatest achievements of the Windhoek Declaration and of African journalists.
Okay, now before we proceed, for the benefit of the viewers, can you just explain to us what exactly is the Windhoek Declaration?
Well, the Windhoek Declaration is actually coming at the time it did, as I say, when Africa was completely controlled, mostly by governments, the media that is. It was an era in which the so-called Nuiko Declaration of UNESCO, which was a declaration that had actually tried, the intent was good. It was trying to alter or change the north-south divide in terms of news. But what it actually did was put information ministries started springing up on the continent, and governments started actually controlling the media rather than allowing the free flow. And so the environment in which Africa was at the time made it almost impossible for an independent newspaper to start up, or certainly an independent radio station to get off the ground, or a commercial station for that matter. So, and also obviously the oppression of media, that little bit of, or those few journalists who wanted to operate independently, it put them under tremendous pressure. The arrests of journalists across the continent was really bad. And so really I think that the journalists gathered together, and some of them were released due to pressure from UNESCO to come and to be able to participate in the seminar. So really that was the attempt on the part of independent-minded journalists, but government media were there too, but their voices were very quickly drowned out as we all insisted that Africa has to recognize the need for independent, free and pluralistic press. And so the declaration itself deals with a lot of these aspects, how governments could and should create enabling environments for the media and for independent media to flourish.
Okay. Now, speaking about that now, how do you think has this particular declaration influenced the Namibian industry in particular?
Well, you know, probably not as much as it should, because I don't think, again, that consciousness, not only in Namibia, but in other African countries, there's not that real consciousness, and maybe it's our fault for not making journalists more aware of the fact that this declaration exists. I think, you know, I mentioned earlier, the reason Namibia or Windhoek was chosen to host the declaration, because we'd just become independent, the winds of change were blowing across the continent, and democracy seemed to be on the way. And so Namibia had already begun to set an example. Our constitution was held up as a shining example in some quarters. And I think, so the press here was already fairly free and fairly open, and it certainly increased after independence. But I think, hopefully behind the scenes, there was further impetus provided by the Windhoek Declaration and the commitments that governments made to that end.
Now it's 30 years later. Do you think a declaration like this is still valid in the 21st century?
Well, look, I think who wouldn't agree, even today, with that concept of a free, independent, pluralistic press and diversity? That's what we really want, isn't it? That our viewers, listeners, readers can make the choices they can make to decide which news they want to consume. So I think that still that ethos behind the Windhoek Declaration is very, very much alive today. Again, we have to realize that, of course, it happened in an era which only affected print and radio, to a lesser extent, although the declaration itself was primarily aimed at print, independent print media. And so 10 years after the Windhoek Declaration, radio people across the continent got together and came up with the African Charter of Broadcasting. So it complements the Windhoek Declaration very nicely in terms of radio. And I think now, although the principles of the Windhoek Declaration remain, people may feel there's a need to update it in terms of the new media and the digital tsunami, if you like, and online media. And that may happen at this meeting in Windhoek on May 3. They won't change or amend the Windhoek Declaration, or they shouldn't, in my view, because that should stand as it is, but they can possibly come up with a new declaration that could complement that.
Now, Gwen, you've earlier spoken about the treatment of journalists 30 years ago and even before that. And you yourself was one of those journalists incarcerated because of doing your job as a journalist. Can you talk to us about that journey of you as a journalist over the years? Okay,
well, it was a pretty tough one. I became a journalist in 1976, which that's a long, long time ago. And at that time, there were certainly very, very few women who were journalists. And if they were on the women's pages, and they certainly weren't in the political mainstream, as I insisted on being at that time in 1976. So whereas today, I think there's still a glass ceiling in place for women journalists, back then it was concrete. So it was it was really, really very hard. I mean, I do think there have been some gains for women journalists in contemporary day as opposed to back then. I mean, we never had things like any labor laws to protect us. We never had any kind of medical aid or maternity leave. Those sort of things were unthinkable. I mean, I think I do always recount the anecdote of when I was working with Hannes Smith after we started the Windhoek Observer, and I gave birth to my son in 1980, and I'd just given birth. And he came to visit me in hospital, and he brought the manual typewriter along, and he said, "I need your column." So it wasn't hours after giving birth that I sat there and typed my column for the week. That wouldn't happen nowadays. That having been said, women still have a long, long way to go. And I think a lot of it, you know, is the circumstances we work in, and misogyny in the newsroom and bullying. There are still those problems, as well as low pay for journalists, especially women. But I think, you know, a lot of it rests with women themselves. Do they want this kind of life? Because no matter how much easier we make it for them, it's still a tough existence. And you know yourself, to be a journalist, to be available 24/7 and still do justice to home and kids and husband, it's a big ask, and it's not something every woman wants to do. So as I say, we've just got to keep at it, Jemima, and hopefully the time will come. We see in our banking sector locally, something we thought would not have happened 10 years ago, and we see women are heading all the major banks. It can happen in journalism too. A lot of it has to do with ourselves. And another thing I did was I didn't sweat the small stuff. People often ask me, how as a woman did you do that? I said, because I often had to forget I was a woman. I had to put small stuff aside. There was no way that I could have the luxury of addressing even things like misogyny. I had to just move on and say, never mind, just get the job done and show them and prove it to them that a woman can do the job.
Now, what do you think should be done, lastly, what do you think should be done to get women in the spotlight?
Well, I think a lot of them are, but I don't know, you know, obviously we need role models, because I think young women who look up to the likes of yourself or perhaps even me and say, wow, I think that is very important for them to see that people like yourself are making a difference in the media, are standing out, you know, because again, we all look at the media and there are a lot of people who are practicing journalists, but you know, their hearts aren't really in what they're doing. So I think the public are far more discerning than we may think. And I think you yourself, if you look at the media spectrum, there are very quickly people who pop out. And the reason they're popping out, I think, is because they have that passion. But not only passion, it has to be, I think, combined with compassion, which is a very, very important aspect of the characteristics of a journalist, because at the end of the day, we should be motivated by service to our communities and to inform them to the best of our ability. But I think, again, we're living in a very materialistic world. A lot of young people, unfortunately, I think, are looking at easier ways to make money than journalism. And journalism, as you know, and as I know, 40 years later, does not make money. We do not get rich off what we are doing. At best, we can hope for a decent existence and hopefully a decent income with the benefits to enable us to do our jobs in peace and in safety. I mean, that is very important. But we're never going to make a lot of money. You're never going to become like an entrepreneur. And I think we have to fight those materialistic tendencies among the youth to attract them to a craft or a profession, call it what you like, that will give them back in terms of what they are putting back into the community, rather than actually just giving them a fantastic material existence. You learn to do without a lot of things, and I must say I wouldn't have had it any other way.
Thank you very much for joining us and for your insight, Gwen.
Thank you, Jemima.
Thank you for joining us. Good night.